We are going to talk about OAuth in this video. More specifically, we are going to talk about OAuth2. OAuth 1 was replaced by OAuth 2 in a very short span of time. OAuth 2 is the only protocol which is predominantly used nowadays, so we are only going to focus on that. OAuth stands for Open Authorization. It is an open standard for delegated authorization. But before going into the details of OAuth, let's look at a problem, then we'll see how OAuth helps us to solve that problem. Imagine a scenario where one system wants to access some other system. This is very common, right? You can think of many examples where one system is trying to access some other system. For example, imagine that you are developing an app, and this app allows users to store and retrieve files on their own Google Drive. And in order for this to work, this app should be able to access Google Drive on behalf of the user. How do we solve this? One of the simplest way to solve this problem is by password sharing. When user logs into this app, it will ask user to input their Google username and password. Then this app will submit that username and password to Google as if the user they themselves are logging into Google. As long as username and password keyed in by the user is a valid username and password, they'll be able to log into Google and they'll be able to access the Google Drive for storing and retrieving. But the problem with this approach is, first of all, we are sharing a password of one system with another system. In this case, we are sharing the password of Google with another app. This is not generally a good idea because only the system which is the custodian of that password will put enough due diligence to keep that information safe. There is no guarantee that this app has same level of interest to protect Google's username and password which Google has. So if this app doesn't store Google username and password in a safe and secure way, that information might get compromised, and if it gets compromised, Google might get bad press, and also you need to change your username and password because your username and passwords are compromised. The second problem is we don't have any way to specify that this app should only access Google Drive. It should not access any other applications that are part of Google. For example, with this username and password that we shared with this app, it could access any of the Google apps that I have access to, right? So it could access Gmail for sending and reading my emails, and it could access some other applications, for example, Google Worksheet and things like that. But I only want this app to access Google Drive. Now, we don't have any way to restrict this app to only access Google Drive. So that is the second problem. So these are the two problems with password sharing. First one is how this app is storing the credentials, and the second one is unable to specify permission to access only Google Drive. Now let's look at how OAuth solves this problem. Before going into the details of OAuth, let's understand some of the terminologies used in OAuth. A system which is trying to access another system is called a client. In this case, our app is that client. And the system that we are trying to access will have two servers. One is called authorization server and the other one is called resource server. In our case, the system we are trying to access is Google, and if Google has implemented OAuth, then it will have both authorization server and resource server. By the way, Google supports OAuth, so it has both of these servers. The resource server is a very generic term for the APIs exposed by Google. For example, these APIs could be Google Drive API or Gmail API or any sort of APIs that Google allows for the client to access using OAuth. So that is what this resource server means. Authorization server is the one which enables the authorization flow. It will have two endpoints. One is called authorization endpoint and the other one is called token endpoint. Okay, now let's look at the flow. When user wants to access Google Drive from this app, the first thing that this app needs to do is it needs to go and register with Google as one of a valid app. And when it goes and registers with Google, it will get something called client ID and client secret. These two will be stored by this app internally. Then, when user is trying to access their Google Drive, they'll be redirected to Google's authorization server. And this authorization server will present Google's login page, and the user will be keying in their username and password on that login page. Remember, This login page is presented by Google itself, and the user is keying in their username and password of Google account in Google login page itself. They are not keying in that information in our apps page. They are directly keying in Google login information in the Google's login page itself. When the authentication was successful, they'll be asked whether they should allow this app to access their Google Drive. It will also list the APIs that this app is requesting to access. If user is happy with that, they'll say yes, which is basically consenting for this app to access their Google Drive, limited to the list of APIs that was listed. Once they have successfully consented, this authorization server will issue something called authorization code, and this authorization code will be received by the app, which is the client. Now, the app will present authorization code, client ID, and client secret to the authorization server, more specifically to the token endpoint, to get something called access token. And this access token is the token that can be used for accessing resource server. This access token will encode two different information. The first one is the scope, which is basically to say that this access token is for this particular user. And the permissions, which is to say that with this access token, only these APIs can be accessed. In this case, the scope will be the user who has logged in, and the permissions will be the read-write permissions of Google Drive. Now, with this access token, the app can go to resource server and can access the permitted APIs. In our case, it will be Google Drive's read and write API for storing and retrieving files. Now, as you can see, that we have solved both of the problem that we have seen previously. The first problem is inputting Google's username and password in a third-party app. We have solved this because we are now inputting username and password in Google's own login page. And the second problem is because the access token only allows this app to access permitted APIs, they cannot access any other APIs that the user has not consented to. Another important thing to know is both of these authorization code and the access token are opaque token from the client side, meaning they should not try to parse this token, because for the client, it doesn't meant to have any meaning. They should simply store them and pass them to the authorization server or resource server whenever the client is trying to access one of them. Because we are delegating this app to access our own Google Drive APIs, we are calling this as delegated authorization protocol. This is how OAuth works at a very high level. Hope this is useful. Thank you.